So the Nintendo Switch 2 is obviously more powerful, faster, and from a hardware perspective, better than the original Switch. So if you're buying a Nintendo console in 2026, obviously you get the Switch 2, right? Well, maybe. The original Switch still has an enormous library of good games, and the used market completely changes the value equation of buying a Nintendo console this year. Now, in reality, there's roughly 3 different types of buyers that are looking at Nintendo stuff right now, and you're gonna have people who don't own either a Switch 1 or Switch 2. You're gonna have people who already own a Switch and are considering upgrading. And then you have people who are looking for straight up the cheapest way into the Nintendo ecosystem and just wanna play great games. Now in this video, I'm not really trying to explain which one is better from a hardware standpoint. Again, that's obviously the Switch 2. But what I wanna do is help people determine which one makes sense for them to buy this year going into 2027. I think one of the first things you should think about is what games do you actually want to play? Before you consider any of the hardware limitations between one or the other console, I think it's important to recognize that with the Switch 1, you still have access to a massive library of good games that we all love. You've got things like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Super Smash, you've got Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Mario Wonder, Metroid, and a bunch of other third-party titles that are just absolutely phenomenal. If you bought an original Nintendo Switch today, you'd probably have the ability to spend years playing games before ever feeling the need to upgrade to the new console in order to play Switch 2 exclusives. But with the Switch 2, you do get backwards compatibility with original Switch games. You're gonna have access to new releases and current Switch 2 releases. Then you're also gonna have access to better versions and performance on some games that are already out on the Switch 1, games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And then you're also gonna have access to any games that come out from third-party developers down the road that may never come to the Switch 1 platform. And I guess one way to look at this is, are you buying a Switch because you want to play Nintendo's previous 8-year catalog, or are you buying a Nintendo console right now because you want to play Nintendo's next 8 years of releases? Now, one other thing that I think is really worth noting here is that the Switch 2 unlocks a very specific feature that the Switch 1 will not allow you to use. And that is that if you have the Nintendo Online subscription with the expansion pack, you now have access to their online GameCube port library. Now this library is still a little bit small, but just like all the other systems that they've ported over to the online system, this library will continue to grow. The original Switch will still let you play the online ports of NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, Virtual Boy if you have the correct hardware, and Nintendo 64. But if you want the GameCube stuff, the Switch 2 is the only way that you're gonna be able to use that. Again, I do wanna just mention that you do have to have the online subscription with the more expensive expansion pack, but that expansion pack also has some other features that you may or may not be interested in. Now, I'm definitely not telling you to run out and spend hundreds of more dollars just so you can play some GameCube games, but if you're already paying for the expansion pack or planning to pay for it, and you're into retro Nintendo games, this is another entire library of stuff that only the Switch 2 is gonna bring to you. Now, what does the Switch 2 actually do better? Well, pretty much everything. And we don't really need to spend a lot of time here because we know that the Switch 2 has much better hardware capabilities than the Switch 1, but it has a larger, higher resolution screen, better performance, faster loading, more internal storage, which I think is gonna become a big thing in the future that we wanna keep our eye on, better Joy-Cons with a better mounting system to the side rails, in my opinion, and we're seeing better support on the Switch 2 from third-party developers for modern games than we ever saw on the Switch 1, in my opinion. So if you're looking for whichever console is technically superior, the Switch 2 is a no-brainer. Now, this whole conversation changes a lot when you kind of determine how you're gonna buy. If your plan is to buy new, my thought process is that this is a pretty easy choice, and the Switch 2 is probably the best way to go. If you buy a brand new Switch, they are running right around $340, whereas for about $100 extra, you can still get a Switch 2 for $449. Now that price increase is coming, but nevertheless, I think if you're buying in the new market, going with the Switch 2 just makes sense. And if you look at stuff like the OLED, you're paying, I think, about $400, which to me, if I'm buying hardware brand new, I don't want to pay that kind of money that's already that close to the Switch 2 pricing for hardware that's like, I don't know, 8 years old at this point. And when it's possible, I do recommend buying a new console because when you buy it new, you're getting brand new hardware that you don't have to worry about. You get a new battery and you're not guessing what the battery life looks like, and then you're also gonna get to take advantage of whatever warranty Nintendo offers on new hardware. So if you're buying brand new and you're still thinking about going with the Switch, in my case, I would need to see a pretty heavy discount or some kind of a promotion. However, if you're okay purchasing from the used market, this conversation gets a lot more interesting. On the used market, the Switch 2 is still gonna cost you a little bit of money. It's probably gonna cost you somewhere in the ballpark of like $400, maybe $380, depending on how good you are at negotiating. Whereas the Switch 1, the Switch OLED, and the Switch Lite can all be had at a pretty heavy discount because there's so many of these on the used market since they've been around for almost a decade. Earlier today, I checked my local marketplace listings and I saw somebody selling a working Switch OLED for $160. Now that's definitely on the low end, but if you keep your eyes open and you're a little patient, you can get these at a heavy discount and still get into the Nintendo ecosystem for not a lot of money. So let's just say you had like 300 bucks. Well, if you have 300 bucks, you can put that in a savings account, save up to get your Switch 2, or that same $300 can get you an original Switch or a Switch OLED. And typically for 300 bucks, you're gonna be able to get a console plus a Pro controller, maybe a couple physical games. So if you're working with a fixed budget, you sort of have to decide which one of these is gonna let you get in and play more games today if that's your goal. Now, if you're gonna buy a used Nintendo console, regardless of what it is, test it. One of the things that you're gonna wanna test is stick drift, and Nintendo actually gives you a way to test this out easily. If you go to System Settings, Controllers and Sensors, Calibrate Control Sticks, that's gonna actually give you a spot where you can check what the joysticks are doing. You're gonna wanna play around with the thumbsticks, take your hands off and see and make sure that they go back to the center. Check the full range of motion, and again, just make sure that it consistently goes back to center. I definitely wouldn't just open up Mario Kart, play a lap, and then decide, oh, feels pretty good. You wanna actually go in and verify that it is good. You're also gonna wanna check the buttons on any controllers that are coming with the console, and you can test this real easily by going to Controllers and Sensors, and then Test Input Devices. That's gonna allow you to test all the buttons and make sure that every single button you push actually registers correctly. Now, even if some of the buttons don't work, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take advantage of whatever the deal is, but you're gonna wanna negotiate based off what you find. You're also gonna wanna make sure that any Joy-Cons included in the sale connect correctly to the Nintendo and that they're not super loose or anything like that. I would also test the cartridge reader, so bring a physical game with you and actually insert it and make sure that it reads. You're also gonna wanna check the charging, so plug a USB-C cable into it, make sure that it recognizes and starts to charge. Check the screen for scratches and any dead pixels, things like that. And then if possible, make sure that the dock works if one is included in the sale. Another one that's easily overlooked is the microSD slot. Bring a microSD card with you if you can, plug it in and make sure that it recognizes it. And then you're gonna also wanna make sure that the Switch can recognize nearby wireless networks. Now, in a perfect world, you would only buy a Switch that you can fully check at somebody's house or your home, but that's not always gonna make sense in every situation. But basically, I would just tell you, don't buy a Nintendo Switch in a situation where you just can't test it properly. And obviously, you're gonna wanna exercise normal marketplace safety procedures. Bring somebody with you if you're not fully comfortable, and then always tell somebody where you're going. But I think more importantly, don't sacrifice your personal safety just to save like 50 bucks. And then if somebody seems hesitant to let you fully test the console, I'd probably steer away from that deal. I'm not saying they're trying to scam you, I just wouldn't volunteer to pay money to find out. And another thing with used consoles, if the console is advertised as, oh, Nintendo Switch plus 40 games included, if they're not physical games, you can't take them into account because those games are tied to that person's Nintendo account, not to the hardware. Now, what if you already own a Switch? Should you buy a Switch 2? Does it make sense to upgrade? Well, this is a completely different conversation. I guess the best thing to ask yourself is, what is my current Nintendo Switch preventing me from doing that I want to do? If you're already super happy playing Mario Kart 8, Mario Odyssey, and all the Zelda games, and you still have a lot of game time left before you're finished with those games, you maybe don't have to upgrade to the Switch 2 just because it exists. But if you want Switch 2 exclusives and there's specific games only available on the Switch 2 that you want, or if you're looking for those GameCube classics, better performance, or improved versions of games that are already out on the Switch 1, and you're really looking forward to some of Nintendo's upcoming releases, then upgrading is pretty easy to justify. I guess a good way to look at this is I would only upgrade to the Switch 2 if it allows you to do something that you actually want to do already. But what if you own neither of these consoles and you're trying to decide which one to purchase in order to enter the Nintendo ecosystem in 2026 going into 27? If you can comfortably afford either one, or this is going to be your primary Nintendo console and you're planning to keep it for multiple years, several years, maybe 5, 10 years down the line, then I would say buy the Switch 2. Again, you're going to get newer hardware, current hardware. You're going to get the current and future library that's coming out on the Switch 2, and you're going to get compatibility with physical Switch 1 games that you can get on the used market for really affordable prices. But there is a huge exception here. If you're on a budget, if your budget is a limiting factor for you, and let's say you've only got $250 to $300 to spend and you can't quite swing the Switch 2, instead of taking out Klarna payments on the newest console, a used original Switch or an OLED is honestly not a bad deal, and it still has a lot of capability to give you tons of hours of play without breaking the bank. So let me just go ahead and clean this up and condense it for you. If you're saying, I want a Nintendo console as cheaply as possible, go ahead and get a good used Switch 1 or Switch OLED. Take advantage of the huge library that's available to you by using that extra money to go and buy games that are already out there. If you're the person that doesn't own either console yet and you want to keep your new console for multiple years in the future, get the Switch 2. Of course, you want to make sure that it fits into your budget in that case. If you already own a Switch and the Switch 2 has some features or games or different things available for it that you really, really want, then again, if it fits into your budget, moving up to the Switch 2 is a good idea. But if none of those things matter to you, like the exclusive games for the Switch 2, the GameCube online library, or the slightly faster performance with older games, if none of that matters to you, just keep your Switch and wait until prices hopefully at some point come down, at least in the used market on the Switch 2. So the Switch 2 being better from a hardware standpoint in pretty much every aspect doesn't necessarily make the original Switch bad or obsolete. The OG Switch actually has something going for it now that it didn't have a couple years ago. It's affordable. The original Switch is still super compelling, especially if you're willing to go into the used market and explore what's available for purchase near you. So I'd love to hear from you guys what some of your favorite accessories and games and different things like that have been for the Switch 1 or the Switch 2 that have made it just a more enjoyable ownership experience. And then if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, go ahead and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it just because I like seeing those numbers come up. And if you have any ideas for videos and topics that you think would be helpful for you or for other people that are new to the Nintendo platform, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Until next time, don't forget to always have a tasty beverage on hand, and let's freaking get it.